Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest Q community update. We've got a fairly packed agenda, so we're going to fairly move through things to leave as much time as possible for Q&A at the end. I won't read out the agenda. We'll just get straight into each of these items here. So hopefully there's something in the agenda for everyone on the call and anyone who follows along afterwards. Just as a brief project update, it's been just over 2 months since our last call. We've had a fairly busy summer in terms of work we've been doing on the Q project and things like the central registry as well. We're finding the monthly cadence a bit tight, and so aiming for a 4 to 6 week cadence that also allows for sort of more substantive updates on larger bits of work that happen in that time period. We're continuing to use release projects and roadmap projects for keeping track of what we're working on. And release project, for example, for the 0.11 release captures what is still outstanding, but Daniel will talk a bit more about that in just a second. And indeed, here are the release updates. And so over to Daniel.
Yep, so last time we gave an update, we were about to do the final 0.10.0 release. That did happen in August. It did include the embed experiment, lots of work for the evaluator, TOML, JSON schema, and lots of other stuff. We have not felt the need to do a bug fix release so far, but that is still an option if needed. And then we are in the middle of the release cycle for 0.11. We've done 3 alphas with plenty of stuff. New built-ins mainly for JSON schema, lots of new evaluator work, lots of JSON schema work, and lots of other stuff I'm not going to get into. But I will briefly shout out that if Alpha 3, the latest alpha, does include a new cycle detection algorithm in the new evaluator, which Marcel will talk about. And we're aiming for the final release roughly early November. So hopefully no more alphas at this point, just release candidates. And then something that we want to be aware of is what people or projects are stuck on old Q versions and why. I am personally aware of a few, but every now and then I find about somebody else. So I want to be a bit more active about this. So if any of you are stuck on an older version because of performance regressions, for example, and I know we've been talking about these for a while, but there's also other kinds of regressions that might block you from updating, such as evaluator regressions in how it behaves, or if it starts failing, or maybe the Go API broke you and you're a Go API user, or maybe some other reason. If that's the case, please reach out to us because we want to be on top of it.
Yeah, modules might be another such reason that people are not upgrading as well. So please just flag all of these things. Thanks, Daniel. I think we can now move straight into the evaluator. Matthew and Marcel.
Yes, let me put up some notes as well. So we are now, just as a reminder, we're working on a new evaluator. We call it Eval v3. The version is a bit fungible, but that's the name we use. And really the goal here is to mostly improve performance, but also to increase simplicity and maintainability. We found that thinking about and fixing bugs in a new evaluator is far easier than the older one. So it's currently available already as in both the API and CLI, as we announced previously. So we've also had many people trying it out and filing bugs. Thanks for that. That's been very helpful. Next slide. So related to this was also a bunch of JSON schema fixes that are also related to this new evaluator. So since last time, so there's been many fixes. There's 44 issues that have been closed that are, or at least that have issues that have been fixed for Eval v3. So some of them were reported in v2 and they now are fixed in v3, or they were already fixed in v3. And there's a whole bunch of issues that were reported for Eval v3 specifically that now have been fixed. There is 8 more open issues, I believe, on the Eval v3. So we've been focusing, so we also have a bunch of internal issues. There's about 20 to 30 left. There's a lot of overlap there, and probably also some overlap with the issues, but we've been focusing on user issues specifically so that people that are using v3, we get them going again. So so this is just what is reported. There is a bit more fixed in my client that will be uploading hopefully before the next alpha. So then also, as we mentioned last time, Matthew just started. He's been now getting up to speed and already contributing to the new evaluator. So we now have more people working on the evaluator, which is really great. So then another big improvement since last time. So a lot of the problems appear to be, and also like any improvements appear to be hampered by the cycle detection, which is way too complicated. Eval v3 had part of the cycle detection not implemented yet. And instead of also implementing that component, we decided to just completely redesign it, to simplify it. That was partly inspired by an idea from some work that Matthew did on a parallel queue evaluator that's more for experimental and learning. So that really helped there. So then field ordering. So one of the impediments also of launching it is that Eval v3 has a more sloppy field ordering than v2, just because we didn't implement it yet. It roughly did the same thing, but it's a bit more unpredictable. So now we also said, okay, let's fix field ordering, at least stabilize and make it a lot more predictable, and ideally also make it the same for v2 and v3, so that the transition between the two will be a lot easier. That will depend a little bit on how easy it is to figure out differences in Unity. So Matthew has been implementing that, more on that later. And then now we're getting ready to flipping the state. So flipping the default basically from Eval v2 to Eval v3. So there's still bugs left, but we're getting to a point that the number of outstanding bugs in v2 is bigger than the number of outstanding bugs in v3, actually. So yeah, so what is necessary to flip it? So some critical bug fixes, the field ordering, so finer grained structure sharing that needs a little bit more explanation. So as we mentioned later, so one of the outstanding issues which might actually slow you down in v3 versus v2 is the memory management. So right now we don't free any memory as we're computing in v3, whereas in v2 we do, and that's a major performance difference. However, what we've seen with some of the projects in Unity that are hampered by this, it's actually, the slowdown is actually caused by a known performance bug. It's not really a bug. It's like how Q should operate, but there's an optimization for it, sort of a memoization-like thing that can significantly improve performance there. And rather than fixing the memory, well, it's not really a leak, but basically doing the garbage collection, since the projects only are like in the same order of magnitude, but slower, it seems like better to fix that problem. We reduce the memory usage about just as much as if we fix the memory problem. Also, the not fixing the memory will make these performance problems very clear. So by fixing the big O of the algorithm, we expect to see just as much or maybe even more performance improvement than actually fixing the memory issues. So we're very close to getting these big O improvements, to having next levels of structure sharing. It's multiple stages, so some of it should really drastically improve some of the projects out there from what we can see right now. Yeah, so right now we do have a bunch of issues in Unity still. They seem to be all related to a bunch of issues that we're aware of and that we are fixing. So hopefully we're getting to fixing most of Unity quite quickly. So one of the things we won't do before flipping is, as I said, maybe not reduce all memory management. There is one memory consumption thing that we could reduce quite significantly, but most of it we will not reduce first. Then also we won't fix all outstanding v3 bugs before flipping to v2. So as long as Unity passes, if there's outstanding v3 bugs, we will, we might consider flipping anyway, because and keep v2 around so that people can fall back on v2, because there's just more bugs in v2 basically right now than in v3. So good enough to move. So this is also a good incentive once more to join Unity, because we will be looking in Unity to as a decision point, like will we make the flip or not. Yeah, next slide. So then there might also be an issue if you're moving from V2 to V3 because of bug fixes in V3. So this is the most pronounced one. So if you have like an inline struct, like sort of, you see this often in the function, like pattern, basically, where you unify a definition with some struct and then do index and outfield or whatever. So in V2, the fact that this came from a definition was lost, so the result was not closed, which was clearly an error. And now in V3 this is fixed, which means that some configurations might be broken by that. The solution is fairly simple. It's to make this .out part an embedding instead of unifying it. That will fix it, but it might break V3. So let us know if this is causing huge problems. We haven't made a Q fix for this because it might be very complicated and it might be easier to just fix it by hand. But if this turns out to be a very big problem, then we could consider that. Next slide. Yeah, so another big thing is field ordering. So this is even in V2, this was because field ordering was somewhat sloppy. So we figured that this was a good time to address that. It's also a nice project for Matthew to get up to speed, because you need to know quite a bit about the evaluator. So there's many decisions to make there, and we're not quite sure where we will end up eventually. But basically, if we look at some of the, we had a little offsite together, we came up with some, absolute requirements. So one of it is that if you're unifying a struct with a definition, we want to be able to retain, at least in the output, when you export, we want to retain that definition order. I've noticed from, for example, the Pickle folks at Apple that they're doing this, and they say it's absolutely paramount. We notice from a lot of Q users that they find this quite important. A lot of other configuration languages do not do this. But this is, often results in complaints by people who think this is not good for a configuration language like Q. So that was one of the first requirements. And then another requirement, which can be achieved in many ways, is stability, so that if you change the file name or you change some few things, that it doesn't change the order all that much. Right, and then this is also then a question: how would this interact with comprehensions? And ideally, also we would make this compatible between V2 and V3 to help in the transition, so that people can easily compare the differences. So a non-goal, though, is that we now come up with a ordering algorithm that will be the same forever in perpetuity. Right, that's not the goal right now. So we of course hope it won't change too often, of course, but it might change from one Q version to the next. Next slide. So yeah, so in the interim, so what we found, so in order to implement schema ordering, so version V2 has a very weak implementation of a topological sort. So, and in order to get funnily enough, in order to get the schema definition or definition ordering proper, it actually turns out to be not that easy as it seems, and it actually seems that topological sorting is the easiest way to accomplish that. It's the easiest way to reason about it from an implementation perspective. So it makes our lives a lot easier. So that was a big hint that we should stay with the topological sort. Basically, what this boils down to is if you have one schema A, B, C, and then you unify that with another that reverts C and B, then you, or the other one has C and D, for example, then that fully defines the ordering, and you keep that ordering. If there's any cycle or conflicts, we break it on a lexicographical tiebreaker, basically. So another reason to pick topological sort is that we found that topological sort is actually quite fast. whereas a lexicographical sort is not. So probably for comprehensions, we will also use the topological sort, because it is deterministic, and it's actually faster than doing a lexicographical sort. The other thing which is quite nice about the topological sort is that it's quite pluggable, so it's quite separate from the rest of the Q evaluation. So we can very easily change parameters about it in the future, completely independently from other implementation. But again, in the future, we might change the criteria. We have various ideas what might work better, but topological sort really is the simplest thing to do at the moment. Next slide, or is there a question somewhere?
I think the question was relating to Unity, but
Okay.
we can take that afterwards.
Yeah. So then the next steps is, so we investigate Unity deviations also to see, like, do we need to update V2 or not for the, wait, I think this, this is not for the topological sort anymore. Yeah, for the evaluator next step. So the next thing to do is really look deeper at some of the discrepancies we get in Unity. And then basically, you know, we're working towards getting to a point. So for V12, probably flipping the default from V3 to from V2 to V3, where most of Unity is passing, or ideally all of it. You know, we have the field ordering implemented, and we have the finer grain structure sharing implemented. So note that V2 bugs are no longer actively maintained unless it's very easy to do so. But really, most bugs at this moment, V2 is so much more complex than V3. It's very time consuming to fix bugs there. Generally, we'll just not fix them anymore. So, you know, V11 would really be the last, you know, would be a very advisable to start testing the V3 evaluator.
We'll make sure we've actually got some good docs. Jonathan is on the call with us here. We should also just make sure we clearly signal some docs on how to do that test. For example, just include a very basic getting started guide with eval v3 on qlang.org, and then we'll link that from these slides here just as an easy prompt.
One more note is there has actually been a lot of very significant fixes since the last alpha release. So I don't know if we want to do another alpha release before the final release, but there's been significant improvements in eval v3 and TIP right now.
Could be wise, because otherwise we'd be jumping straight to a release candidate, which would be slightly an odd signal from an eval v3 perspective. Great. Matthew, anything to add from your perspective? Marcel, thank you very much indeed. Just a brief mention on Q with other languages. There's been, just chatting to one person since the last call, they're looking to build an experimental Rust API on top of libq. So please let us know if you're experimenting in this area here. libq exists where Q is exposed as a C API. And based on that, we've got Java and Python based APIs as well. With Jonathan's help, we also have some guides to help get help people getting started with these different APIs. As I said, please let us know if you are experimenting in this area. That's going to help us to prioritize which areas we work on the most when it comes to Q and other languages. And semi-related to that, of course, is encodings, but in a different way. Daniel.
Yep. So like I mentioned, we did ship 0.10.0, which did include the initial support for TOML, which had been requested for some time. So as a reminder, when we add a new encoding, that means you can use it to generate that encoding from Q. You can import it as well. So for example, to validate some TOML data. And you can also use it via the Go API. So in this case, the package encoding/TOML within our module. And 0.11 in the alpha is already shipping with multiple improvements, including a Q built-in package. So that means within a Q file, you can import encoding/TOML and use Marshall and non-Marshall APIs, as well as support for time and dates, which wasn't included in 0.10. I will also mention briefly that it's not ready as an experiment or as a demo, but I am working on a Q2Go type generator. And it's basically the opposite of Q-Get-Go, because QGetGo looks at Go types and tries to generate reasonable Q definitions from them. But in many cases, having Q as a source of truth is better. For example, if you already write validations in Q, having the schema also in Q as the source of truth makes the most sense. And Q can express much more about the types, about the schema, than the Go type system can. Because, for example, in the Go type system, you can only say this is a slice. You cannot say, for example, it has to be of length at least 3 or maximum 10, things like that. And one example that we run into pretty often, and I think many users do as well, is a Go program consuming, for example, JSON config with being driven by a Q schema. So you need the Q schema to validate with, but you also need a Go type if you want to be able to load the data into your Go program without doing reflection or map of string to any and things like that.
Great. I was going to only add that for the TOML support and the Q2Go type generator, we'll be using these pretty heavily within the Q project itself. So again, just a reminder if there one was needed, that with a lot of the things where users and/or we run into issues, that's how those are the things we're prioritizing. So please flag if there are things that you think we should be focusing on that we're not focusing on bluntly. We're not prioritizing only the things that we're interested in. Indeed, a lot of this stuff is actually, for example, the TOML work and different encodings is entirely motivated by others. It just happened that we found a place where we use TOML, and so we started dogfooding it ourselves. Great. Building on the encoding stuff, Rog, talking about encoding, specifically JSON schema.
Yeah, so JSON schema we've had support for JSON schema for quite a while, but the support has been, let's say, limited. As motivated partially by our central registry work, I've been making a bunch of JSON schema improvements. And as a sort of reminder, the JSON schema is a large ecosystem, lots of people creating JSON schemas with many very useful schemas, which aren't available to Q. Now, it's really useful to have those as part of Q schemas. So this is motivating the work that we're doing here, and we've done quite a lot since the last community update. Next slide, please. So as a sort of ground truthing, like how good we actually are, there is actually a really nice, useful extra JSON schema test suite, which I've linked to there, which defines in JSON, of course, a bunch of tests for JSON schema. And so we've imported those into the Q repository, and now we run those tests as part of our CI. And of course, all the tests do not pass, and it's possible that all the tests, we might never get to 100% because there are some hard to implement JSON schema features. But so we basically have all those tests in the CI, and we mark the ones that don't pass as explicitly with the errors in place, and we include the test statistics as an artifact in the Q repository, so we can actually track progress as to how we're getting on with fixing those tests. Next slide, please. So as an example of some of the improvements, we've added some new support for some keywords we didn't before, so not, max properties, if, then, else. And we've improved a bunch of other things like all of and one of. One of in particular is very widely used and really didn't work as it should have been. And in order to support those didn't all map very nicely to Q directly, but we've added a couple of not even standard library, core built-ins to the language to support some of those. In particular, match n and match if. Match n says, given a list of schemas, how many of these match? And you can use that to implement any of, all of, and one of quite neatly. And we have at least one contributor who's made some, I'm not going to pronounce the name, who's been it's been very useful contributing making some contributions in this area, which has been nice. Next slide, please.
Yeah, just to quickly jump in, yes, to echo those thanks, because that's really there's been a huge number of changes that we've been making, and this contributor especially has actually sort of been making changes interleaved with those, and it's been really, really well received. So thank you. Just to flag as well, to emphasize the point that the keywords that Roger's talking about here, of course, they also extend to supporting Open API as well, the schemas with an Open API. So it's a known problem up until we made these fixes, for example, that deriving Q from Open API in the most common situations was going to hit problems because of the poor support for one-off. So that is one of the principal reasons, along with just the general JSON schema ecosystem more generally, for actually doing this work, is it allows us to sort of kill two birds with one stone, as it were, and help the folks in the JSON schema space as well as the Open API space, even though they're fundamentally sort of very, very similar in terms of what it is they're declaring schema-wise.
There's actually, let's go back slightly.
Sure.
There's one thing I mentioned that I forgot to put on this slide actually, is that one important thing is that we actually recognize different JSON schema versions now. And this is something that you might have a problem with, because before we basically interpreted keywords regardless of version, but that's actually very much incorrect with regard to JSON. So we actually interpret keywords according to exactly what version is declared. And this might result in regressions if you're using JSON schema extraction, because you might have been using a keyword and a version that actually didn't support that keyword. And before we would have just interpreted it regardless. And now we will not. We will either ignore or reject that keyword.
That's worth pointing out. We'll update the slides, because there's also a nice change to basically reporting situations where JSON schema does or doesn't conform with a particular expected target schema version, and also then relaxing to allow a sort of unknown keywords as well. But
yeah, I mentioned that in a subsequent slide actually.
Oh, apologies. Then great.
So this is like a graph of improvements over time. So this, I said we recorded the stats inside the repo. So I just today just extracted those stats and turned them into graphs, so you can see how the percentage of passing tests is going up, although it's still not nearly as high as we'd like it to be. And so the blue line is the percentage of schemas inside the external test suite that we have successfully extracted, and the red line is the overall number of tests that are passing over time as the commits go into the Q repo. Next slide. Yes, so this is the one we mentioned. We've actually got more flexibility on the command line to specify what you. Before there was a strict flag, which you could say be strict about importing JSON schema, and that was quite imprecise in terms of what it meant. It could have meant, do we reject keywords that we don't understand or we haven't implemented yet, or do we reject keywords that we don't understand, that aren't known about at all? And they both have independent use cases, and you can actually specify those directly on the command line now. And actually that capability is potentially useful for all kinds of other encoding schemes where you have some feature that you might want to specify on the command line that applies to an encoding scheme specifically. And so you might well see more of that kind of attribute value pair thing, which was actually technically implemented but not really used by anything until now. And I say, yeah, the global strict flag is now deprecated. It's still there, but you can use JSON schema plus strict if you want to get exactly that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as far as JSON schema is concerned, we're going to continue making improvements to those, and we really want to support generating JSON schema itself from Q in like Open API does something along those lines, but we want to do better than that. Next slide, please.
Super. It's sort of related. Roger will come back and give a sort of further update in a second on more JSON schema things. You can see it's been quite a focus since the last community update. Briefly on the subject of modules, and Roger, please jump in with any corrections here. No specific updates to call out since the last community call, as in we have flipped to new modules by default, and indeed we have an FAQ that helpfully describes the distinction between new and old modules for any folks who might be on older versions of Q, as Daniel alluded to earlier on. please use the FAQ as a means of sort of getting up to speed on things you need to be aware of when you're making that transition. But really, there's been no change to the module's implementation itself since last time, save the central registry itself, but I'll talk about that in a second. One thing we are looking to do now is explore dependency islands. This is a phrase we've used before, where if you have a large configuration with different systems, for want of a better phrase, deployed within that configuration, you don't want any interaction between versions of those different systems that you have deployed, i.e. System A has a specific configuration, System B has a specific configuration, and you don't want MVS or any sort of version resolution to be at play when resolving those dependencies. That's what we refer to as dependency islands. We're acutely aware this is something that people need. We need it as well. And really the work we've been doing in the module space and the work that Roger's going to talk about that we've been doing in the JSON schema space is a nice prelude to that, because it actually gives us some schemas in the central registry around which we can base that exploration of the dependency islands. So more on that from Roger in a second. Just a reminder on the central registry itself. The goal of the central registry is to act as a well-known place for well-known schemas, for well-known services. Really, the idea there being that it should be easy to discover, understand, etc. schemas, or maybe even templates and configurations themselves, or policies, but principally for now, schemas that you might need in order to validate your particular service, CLI configuration, whatever it might be. It's domain name-based namespacing, and only allowing GitHub.com rooted modules for now. But there are plans to relax that and support, for example, vanity domains. Semantic version based, so very similar to Go's modules, and supports publishing of native Q modules, or, and as Roger will talk about in a second, those that are derived from sort of some upstream, in quotes, source of truth. Just to chuck out a couple of examples, a project might validate its configuration using CLI project, might validate its configuration using Q. Publishing that schema to the central registry is then a good way for other people who may want to validate that configuration for whatever reason, can do so transparently using the Q command or the Go API. The central registry is then an easy place for them to actually discover that as well. Project B, which you could sort of roughly see as something being like Kubernetes, it's configured using YAML. They could publish Q schemas, in that case derived from something like OpenAPI to the central registry, again for ease of discovery and validation. So this way the central registry is really looking to act as a point of discovery as well as a point of sort of authoritative versioning as well. If you think you've got a use case with the central registry, please let us know. We're very keen to sort of, we've had some excellent conversations with folks who have been using modules for the first half of this year. If you think you have a use case for the central registry, perhaps your project is considering sharing Q schemas, native or otherwise, with others, central registry would be a good place to actually do that. Let us know. Happy to sort of jump on a call and talk about ideas of how we can best support you. The central registry is live in alpha right now. The invite requirement is going to disappear imminently. That's something we're aware of, and that will sort of mark us moving slightly more officially to an alpha phase. We're working on early versions of documentation, like the documentation you see on package.go.dev for Go modules, and similarly, a search and discovery mechanism very similar to that of other sort of module sites, package.go.dev, npm, whatever it might be. Hence, the next steps being to improve that documentation support, because as you'll see in a few slides' time, it's a tricky problem to get right, especially with fairly deeply nested schemas. Release an initial version of search and discovery, and to help those who are moving to use the central registry, also looking to improve the authn experience when it comes to using things like CI to make that a trivial 1 or 2 step process. In the backlog of things that we are going to consider down the line, vanity domain support, like Go modules, we don't want there to be a restriction on GitHub only based modules in the future. And having other sources for modules is absolutely something on the list, including what we refer to as vanity domains, where if you just happen to own a domain name that is not tied in any way to something like GitHub or GitLab, you just own the domain, you should also be able to publish modules under that namespace too. I think that's it from the central registry perspective. Rog, I'm going to hand back to you for talking about JSON schemas on the central registry.
Yeah, so one of the motivations for all the JSON schema improvements was to actually publish, to take some of those external JSON schemas and publish them to the central registry. And part of that was we wanted to eat our own dog food. We wanted to actually use some of those schemas because inside the Q repository, we actually use Q, of course, for generating GitHub Actions, for generating that YAML, and we want verification that the schemas that we're using correspond to actual GitHub Actions schemas. And beforehand, we were basically vendoring those in a very ad hoc way, those JSON schemas into our code. And now we've got this slightly better support, and we've actually got some code that actually publishes those automatically to the central registry. Actually, it's not quite automatic yet, it's nearly there, and essentially takes those one of GitHub Actions JSON schema from schema store, bundles it up into Q, potentially add some tweaks, because there are not necessarily for example, by default, encoding JSON schema imports it as a top level package thing, but in Q that's not very idiomatic. So there are a few tweaks that it makes, and then publishes it as a schema to the GitHub registry, and that import path there is actually live now and actually works. You can see that the Exp1, the Q temp, all those are signals that we're not. This is very much experimental. We're reserving the right to change everything about it, but it works. We're using it, and we're hoping to add way more schemas in that sort of way. Essentially, a set of curated schemas that we think people might find useful, and are going to be publish them to the central registry from external sources of truth in general. Next slide, please. So here's an example of how this very much early stage documentation looks. This is a screenshot of the generated docs for that JSON schema, that GitHub Actions schema. And as you can see, it's not beautiful as yet, but you can see how you can get an idea for how this might become in the future. Might become a really nice place to click and see what actually explore schemas and module packages within the central registry. Next, yeah. And so as a few moments, like we do have, of course, the central registry is versioned. JSON schemas in general are not versioned. They're totally arbitrary. They're mapped by URI, and there is no constant mapping from URI to content. So when we're importing to the central registry, we give these things a version, and if they have dependencies, those things get versions too, and those versions are persistent and consistent, which is something you actually don't get in JSON schema. So those versions are arbitrary. In the future, Paul was talking about dependency islands. One might well want to isolate different dependencies from each other if we're talking about different configuration schemas which actually share common elements. But for now, if you have two versions of a given package, then or a given module, you'll get the latest version. And there's nothing special that we're doing here to publish these schemas. Anyone could take external sources, translate them to Q in whatever way they like, and publish them to the central registry too. And we hope that people actually do that.
As well as native Q modules as well.
Absolutely, as well as native Q modules. Yeah.
Yep.
So as far as next steps, we want to publish a bunch more curated schemas, very early stage ones. We've already got a CL for adding GitLab CI. We added npm package.json because it was a nice example of a JSON schema that had other dependencies, not particularly because we wanted it for ourselves, but it's also a useful case. And Kubernetes, of course, is a huge use case, which we intend to do very soon. And as I said, it's currently published as an experimental path in the central registry, but we want to publish it to somewhere where we actually want to a non-experimental path. That said, we're unlikely to actually remove the schemas that are currently being published. So if you want to use them, we're very unlikely to break that, what's actually published currently. But if you update to new versions, it's very likely that they will change in an incompatible way. So once that's done, I hope that lots of people actually make use of these schemas, because I think they should be very useful. And if you have ideas for ones that you would like us to ingest and publish, then please let us know.
Great. I think we just had a quick question drop in related to that. Richard says, who will own packages and pipelines in the central registry? Will there be a central CI pipeline that will synchronize passages from upstream sources? For example, some JavaScript CDNs allow you to give me a URL and they'll fetch and start serving the package. Richard, that's really part of the space that we're exploring with this work here. Roger made a very good point, is that anyone can publish to the central registry. Let's just assume you've signed up to use the central registry. And if you can demonstrate control of a namespace, for now that's just GitHub based, you can publish whatever modules you like. When it comes to sort of curated, and I'll put that in quotes because again, we're just sort of experimenting with what that actually means. Yeah, there's definitely an element of just starting small, as Rog said, with like a handful of schemas, just so that there's so many tires we need to kick here when it comes to working out, okay, well, what namespace do we publish them to? What do the docs look like that come out the other side? How do we version them? That is a surprisingly gnarly problem when it comes to things that have come from upstream. And so I'm going to sidestep your question for now because it's not something we're tackling right now. Instead, for example, if I was to call out the versioning problem, that is actually a fairly tricky problem that we're going to have to solve, especially when it comes to Kubernetes. Because, for example, let's say Kubernetes we consume as an open API source of truth. Question is, how do we actually version the Q modules in the central registry in a way that sort of logically makes sense for someone who says, oh, we're using Kubernetes version 1.x, and that's the version they want to use. So there's some of the bridges we've got to cross first before we get sort of too ahead of ourselves in sort of pipelines of things where we're doing stuff on demand. It's something we're considering, but I think there's a few more bridges we've got to cross first. But it's an excellent question nonetheless. Roger, I don't know whether you want to add.
No, I think you said everything. Yeah. Next slide.
I think we're there. We're on qlang.org and docs and content. I'm going to hand over to Jonathan. Jonathan, people may recognize from having contributed a vast amount of the content on qlang.org and Q by example. So Jonathan's going to provide an update for us on things that have happened in that space since our last community update.
Thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, hello, I'm Jonathan. We've been focusing since the last community call on quality of life improvements. That is really trying to think about what's it like when people come and experience qlang.org, indeed Q, for the first time, and when they get down the pipe when they're more experienced with it. So those quality of life improvements have been what we've been thinking mostly about. So that's really had two main elements. We've had the things for newcomers. So what have we changed for newcomers? What have we thought about and improved? Well, we've made it so that finding relevant information on qlang.org is easier. You'll notice that on index pages, like the list of all the how-tos or all the tutorials or concept guides, we've now got a better search index in there. One where you can not only look for the title of the page, but you can do a content search, a search inside the content on the pages, letting you much more quickly hone down on those tutorials or those how-tos that are relevant to the thing that you're looking for. We've updated the texts in the guides so that they better match the words that folks are actually searching for. As I'll say close to the end, that's something we're really interested to find out, not just in terms of something that works, but things that don't work for you. So when you were looking around for a document, but your first or second and third attempts to find something didn't match, the searches didn't come back with the pages that you expected, tell us about that, because we want to make updates so that other people, like yourself, can find them when they search for that expected set of prose on the page. We've also changed it so that we're demonstrating Q to readers as early as possible. On the, for example, we now show some brief but seductively powerful Q immediately on the docs homepage, qlang.org/docs. We've also made the experience of following guides on your own computer, such as tutorials, smoother. For example, everywhere that tutorials and guides show a file's contents that you need to copy, they also now include a clickable file icon that copies the correct file name to your clipboard. We always had it for the actual file content, a button for that, but we've added the file name button as well, so that as you go through, there's just less typing to do, less opportunity to make mistakes, and more ability to focus on the actual nuts and bolts, the important stuff of experiencing and learning what Q can do. We've got it so that there are clickable URLs being displayed at various points in the Q command. These take you straight to a qlang.org page explaining what it is that you're seeing. This is just getting started, and it's definitely not present everywhere, but it includes some error messages displayed when evaluation fails in specific circumstances, and there's also some URLs in Q help texts. We expect to expand this, so you can see more of that in the output. Next slide, please. We've also made quality of life improvements for more experienced users. We always had 100% coverage of the code that is run inside the Q, that is presented on qlang.org ever since alpha.qlang got promoted to the main site. But we've now expanded that so that now most Q by example guides are now tested. We've also added searchable guides. In other words, guides that hopefully respond to the search terms that you put in to try and find information about them, that explain the new language features as they're released. Things like the new built-in validators, match n, and shortly we'll have guides for match if when it's released in, I think, experimentally in 0.11. We've also got pages for the embed attribute that allows you to load non-Q files into your Q code. We've been increasing the amount of clickable cross-references on the online Q help texts. If you've ever looked at the Q help texts, you'll see that we have got references to other pages, other Q help texts in there, but on the website version of those weren't always cross-linked. We've started to put those in place. They're not placed universally, ubiquitously just yet, but we're going to expand that so that they become much more cross-linked. And there's the starting point of that. For instance, if you look at Q help mod, you'll find a little set of pages that have the correct cross-linking in there. Next page, please. It hasn't just been quality of life improvements. We've also been pushing out new content and some updated content. The most noteworthy pieces that I spotted since the last call that we had were, as Paul mentioned earlier, the using Q in Java. We've got several new guides under a specific Java API tag that you can find there. We've just published some new reference and concept guides explaining Q export in depth. In particular, the concept guide is a multi-part guide really taking you into the use of it. So I'm really keen to find if people how people respond to that, if you find it useful, or as I'll point out at the end, if you don't find particular bits useful. That's incredibly useful invaluable to find that out as well. We've published a landing page for Q modules. Previously, we've got Roger's excellent reference on Q modules, but it was quite a big read to jump straight into as the very first thing that you ever saw with modules. So we put a landing page in as well that will direct you to specific things, including the excellent reference guide. We've improved the instructions, as I say, for installing Command Q from source in situations where that's the appropriate thing to do in the context you're working in. And we published that FAQ that about the recent change in version 0.11, where a old language feature was finally removed after being deprecated in earlier versions. Next page, thank you. What we got next coming along? Well, we have got some updates to guides on the Q by example repo that are going to use the Q Central Registry, as you've heard from Rog earlier, as their source of truth. We're going to be very much dog fooding, as Rog put it, pulling down those things, those GitHub, those GitLab CI, all of those different elements. We're also going to, I hope, be publishing a new section on the introduction section on qlang.org. It's going to be focused on getting a diverse set of newcomers up to speed with Q, no matter their background or level of experience with data configuration and so on. That's something I'm going to be pushing hard on, because I feel that we've for newcomers, I think we really want to get them excited, invested in what Q can actually deliver for them really, really early on in their journey with Q.
I'll just jump in there, Jonathan, is that we've had
Sure.
some very good feedback, and thanks to those who provided it on Slack or wherever else, on the content that is on qlang.org. Jonathan's done some really good work especially in the concept guides, in explaining how Q can be used in different situations. That feedback has been excellent, as in it's been positive, which has been good. And because they're just able to get a feel for how to use Q. As Jonathan said, though, the negative feedback is also good. If there is any, please do share that, because it helps us to steer. Maybe it is just discovery or search terms, but also the kind of content that people are looking to see. But a big shout out to Jonathan for helping to push that effort on making things more discoverable, and also the language in these guides as well being more adapted to the newcomer to Q.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, as you can tell, I have a background of coming into things and thinking, what's it like for that person the first or second time that they're actually touching that sort of thing, and that's the lens through which I see an awful lot of the challenges in this space. But I will say this: when you come across content that doesn't speak to you, not just if you find something that you think is technically wrong, but just something that doesn't quite gel correctly in your head, come and tell us about it. That is incredibly useful, and I'll give you absolute carte blanche. If you see my name at the top of a piece of documentation, come and tell me in the starkest way you like why you think something's rubbish. I absolutely want to hear that. I give you absolute carte blanche to do that. Please come and talk to us on the website channel, on Slack and Discord, and in the docs and content repo, which is where we track bugs, documentation ideas of things that we want to write, and more wider ranging sort of concepts of how would it be good to present something. Thanks, Paul.
Excellent. I'll let Jonathan stop talking now and enjoy the comment section. I think that was one of the biggest compliments ever. Almost at the end, but certainly not by any means sort of any less important. QLSP updates. Firstly, on naming, QPlease is now named QLSP, and we'll talk about that in a second. The naming was a bit janky. It did follow GoPlease, but the large part is actually that QLSP, the Q part of QLSP, is actually the Q command itself, and I'll talk a tiny bit more about that in a second. So some good progress finally on this frontier. The initial version of the LSP will be available in 0.11.0, with the initial features of formatting, go to definition, hover docs, as in when the mouse hovers over something, generally speaking, and error diagnostics. I talked about this on the previous slide. QLSP will be the command you run in order to run the LSP server itself. Although for 99.9% of users, they will never run it themselves, at least initially. Because, and the next point that covers that, there will be a VS Code extension that is pretty much done as an initial version, and a NeoVim NVim LSP config as well. That will be very bare bones. The VS Code extension can be a bit more sort of expressive in terms of the things we allow you to do via that. We'll just need to work with NeoVim users to sort of discover the best way of perhaps providing like a Q-specific plugin, or building on an existing one to go beyond just the syntax highlighting that exists in JJO/VimQ, I think it is right now. The goal is being entirely cross-platform. That is going to be tricky to assert day one, because we don't have editor-specific tests day one. And so we will be somewhat reliant on users saying, hey, this thing didn't work for me on platform X using editor plugin version Y. So we'll just have to kick the tires on that. But we do have editor-agnostic integration tests as part of the LSP itself That, however, doesn't confirm that this thing actually works in, say, NeoVim on Windows, for example. So we'll have to progress that over time. We shifted the VS Code plugin to the Qlang organization. That's really in preparation for making a whole slew of changes and it being more discoverable, so that then when we publish the initial version of the VS Code extension, it's in a sort of more recognizable namespace as well. So the next steps, I should really have at the top here, release the initial version of the LSP as 0.11. Daniel and Marcel talked about the timeline for 0.11. We may, by the sounds of things, actually do another alpha before a release candidate before the actual version. Daniel sort of said the early November is what we're therefore targeting for the release itself. We will just need to coordinate the release of the VS Code extension, the NeoVim plugin, excuse me, to coincide with that. It would be good. There's going to be bugs. There was in the early days of Go Please, so providing an easy way by which people can report bugs that they're seeing from the editor itself just makes it more likely that people will report bugs. Sort of towards, we also want to add integration tests for things where there's a bug in the LSP itself. And we'll also want help and guidance from people who are sort of more expert in particular editors when it comes to bugs within the editor plugins themselves. We will, so whilst the initial version will be available in 0.11, my plan is that we can then have, like, I think VS Code typically calls these nightly versions, that then a much more current version. So you'd be using the latest version of the extension and the tip version of Q, for example. That will allow people, that would allow us to get bug fixes out more quickly if people are comfortable, for example, using the bleeding edge version of Q. Incidentally, as sort of referring back to a point that Daniel made earlier on, VS Code will start to nag people if you're not using a late enough version of Q. That will hopefully not be too much of a pain, the nag, but at the same time, it will encourage you to upgrade, so you'll then get the latest version of the LSP and hence the latest bug fixes as well. And we'll also want to get some docs, probably a wiki in the first place, in order to help people get up to speed with using the LSP and the specific editors. There've been some kind offers of support of getting support. Yes, I see Kevin talking about Helix and a couple of other editors where they want to add LSP support. Fantastic. Really happy to work in either Slack or Discord with folks in that respect. That's it on the LSP side. We're doing really close to time. The file embedding proposal, just briefly to talk about that, we've made this available, links to the proposal there, and also some docs demonstrating how file embedding works. This first became available in the first alpha of 0.10. There's been some excellent feedback in the discussion around this. Right now, there don't appear to be any red flags on what it is we've proposed, at least not what we've implemented. So the idea is that from the next steps perspective, we're going to mark that embedding proposal as likely accept. And unless there are any further objections, we're actually going to promote the experiment to a full feature in the 0.12 series. We've had some really good feedback on embed itself. People saying, my only feedback is it mustn't be an experiment. It must become the real thing. So that's a good thing. And we'll also we will also be adding more docs as well to sort of more clearly show how embed could be used in different scenarios, for example. Similarly, we're also going to start exploring the export equivalent, which is just the ability to annotate in some way in your queue. This blob of configuration should just actually be splattered out to this JSON file, for example. So more on that in the 0.12. I will quickly hand over to Dominic, though, for the community and ecosystem slides.
Yes, I have I think 1 more minute, so I make it brief. I think there was a common theme on this call that the feedback we receive is super important and helps us tremendously. So I basically want to reiterate on this. We already talked to a lot of users about the central registry and modules, and we hope we can continue to do so. So please, if you already used it or are interested about it, reach out to us. Even when it is public and the invite link is removed, it is not yet the final version. So we really would like to understand what you would like to use it for, what your plan for the central registry would be. the same is true for your Q use cases. It doesn't have to be what you're already doing. It could also be what you want to do or might do. So if you have one project in mind where you think, oh, we could use Q for this, or you want to integrate Q for a team or with a team, or you look at your Q code and are not sure how to optimize this, just let us know. We're always happy to talk. So just reach out to any one of us. We will make it happen. Then if you want to put your logo on the Q website, again, let me know. And please also join our Discord server. I know we started with Slack. We still have Slack. We will continue to use Slack. But Discord has the huge advantage that there is a history. So thus far, we realize it's very helpful and productive to use it. So please join as well. And
Great.
That was it.
Thank you. That was certainly last, but by no means least. Huge thanks. I'll just reiterate the thanks to those who have given us feedback on modules in the central registry in particular. Some brilliant conversations, excellent feedback on things we should be considering in that space. So thank you. That is it. Q&A. We are just over. Apologies. For those who joined us for the presentation, thank you for joining. For anyone who has a question that we haven't covered or would like to talk through now, I'm certainly happy.
Gavin had a question at the very beginning of the presentation.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Have we totally missed that?
About Unity. So for example, he uses Dagger for the builds and even tests. So how to use that? I guess how to use Go-based uses of Q in Unity. So Daniel, you want to take that?
Yeah, so we should be able to support Go tests. So let me follow up with you on that, because depending on exactly how you use the Go API, then it should be doable, but I need some more detail. So I'll follow up with you.
Thanks, Kevin, for the question. Yeah, it's a space where we'll probably just need to dig in, and if there's then like a common pattern of, oh, it should be really easy to add Go-based or Dagger-based or whatever-based things to Unity, we'll look to add support for that as well, if there's sufficient demand. Just a reminder, we'll publish the presentation and the recording. So please feel free in Discord or Slack or wherever, if folks want to ask questions, or in the GitHub discussion, if folks want to follow up afterwards, please just ping us and happy to go through anything. In which case, thank you to everyone who's joined today. Thanks for all the testing of alphas, all the feedback. Please keep that coming, and I look forward to sharing more news of the 0.11 releases over the coming weeks.